and the life of all those tribes. Let's begin in prayer. God be with you. Holy One, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for your spirit that moves in our midst, revealing yourself as far more complex and beautiful than we could ever imagine. Still our hearts, open our minds and our eyes so that we may see you in our midst and know you, in the words of Dr. Gafney. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So a few housekeeping details. The restrooms are in the back of Blodell. Well, it's really the front, but today we're reorienting. So the back of Blodell Hall, the women's room is on this side of the stage. The men's room is on that side of the stage. We have coffee and refreshments, food over here to your right, and then coffee and hot water for tea in the back. We do have a significant coffee allergy among us, and so we ask that if you have coffee, you have a lid on your cup and you keep your cup at your table. You don't walk around with it, okay? Dr. Gafney has been with us since Thursday. She offered a preaching workshop, which will be posted online. And you are welcome as well to come tomorrow. Dr. Gafney will be preaching at both the 9 o'clock and the 11 o'clock services. Tune in by live stream at 11 if you can't be here in person. I want to give thanks for the very generous memorial gift that has made this week possible in honor of Matthew Briggs, a member of the St. Mark's community who died 2 years ago from a very aggressive cancer. He was 31 years old and 32. Sorry, Victoria. And was a great fan of Dr. Gafney's work and the way that it is influencing who the church is becoming. And so I give thanks to Victoria, his spouse, and his friends who are here. And thank you. And so welcome, Dr. Gafney. As you all know, she is a prolific writer. The Women's Lectionary is almost out in all 3 years. And her book around Womanist Midrash. She is a professor of Hebrew scripture at Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University, and lots of other things as well. So welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, and hello to those of you who are joining us via Zoom. Thank you again for this invitation and for all of this hospitality. I'll say a quick word about a women's lectionary for the whole church. It is a 4-volume series because there is a single year volume called Year W. And I think when I said the word SERIES, that person who lives on my phone thought I was talking to her, so it's going. And the 4th volume, which is Year C of the traditional 3 years, so it's a 1 year and a 3 year, which make 4. Year C should be coming out in July. But the press emailed me yesterday to tell me that they put it on holiday special. So if you go to churchpublishing.org, you can buy any or all of the lectionary volumes at 20% off with the code HOLIDAY20. Right. And I am going to pray again because more prayer is good. And that's what we do as Episcopalians is add up prayers, link them like a chain. And I use these prayers. I have 2 students here, and I bet my student who was here from 15 years ago heard a version of this prayer, as well as did my more recent student. I use these prayers to shape the teaching and inform the space of what it is we shall study together, that you may reflect prayerfully. Please join me in the posture of prayer that is most resonant with you. God of many names, Sarah's laughter, Abraham's compass, Hagar's vision, Ishmael's savior, Isaac's matchmaker, Esau's chastiser, Jacob's bag of tricks, Rebecca's midwife, Leah's provider, Rachel's comforter, and the one who remained silent as the bodies of Bilhah and Zilpah were used to breed other people's children. Open our eyes as we wrestle with these stories that have become our scriptures. Holy One, ageless and eternal, teach us to interpret ancient words in contemporary times. Amen. Today's teaching is coming from the Like Jesus, Soon Come But Not Yet, second volume of Womanist Midrash. That volume is going to focus on the former prophets. Can one of my students, who are always and perpetually my students and subject to pop quizzes at any time, tell the assembly what are the former prophets? There's two of you, so you get to choose which one of you it's going to be. Anybody else who knows can say so as well, but I'm always going to pick up my former students. All right. The former prophets are the first subdivision of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is the Jewish canonical order of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Hebrew language canonical order of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament are not the same thing. The Old Testament is a theological statement that presupposes a secondary testament, and using the language of old presupposes newer and supersessionalistly, English is lovely, you can just add suffixes on words, that is somehow a better testament. The Hebrew Bible is a full and sufficient revelation of God and God's love for God's people. In the Hebrew Bible, there are three primary divisions: Torah, prophets, and writings. The Torah, the first 5 books, are the same as the Pentateuch in what will become Christian scripture. There is an additional canon of scripture from antiquity, and that is the Greek canon of scripture that includes the First Testament, the Deuterocanonical works, and the Christian New Testament. And that's the basis of the sequence of books in Christian Bibles, in most Christian Bibles. It's why we who are Anglican and Episcopalian and Roman Catholic and Orthodox have the longer and more complete set of scriptures, and those pesky Protestants, as loud as they are, have the shorter Bible, and also the newer one. The 66-book Bible didn't come into existence in English until 1782. It's an artifact of the American War, right? Because the King James Bible is a Church of England production, and of course they're Anglicans, so they had 80 books, which goes back to the earliest 84, 83 books. And the New Testament writers cited scriptures from the Hebrew Bible, Greek First Testament, as well as the Syriac Peshitta and some other things. So in that Hebrew Bible order, Torah, prophets, writings, the prophets are subdivided into the former prophets that come on the front and the latter prophets. Well, the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And so this volume of Womanist Midrash got so long, and by the time I got to the point that I had written it, I had so I had a little influence at the press. So I said, I'm going to stop writing now and break this book into 2 pieces. And they said, okay. So if you followed me on Twitter when there was such a thing as Twitter, my earliest hashtag was hashtag Womanist Midrash prophets, but then it had to be former prophets because I wrote a lot and then I had to stop. So we're going to be looking at selections from the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. I'm going to share with you a bit from the book. I'll be weaving in and out, reading portions of the book, and we will be engaging in the exercise of the sanctified imagination is what it is in the Black preaching tradition. I will encourage you in your own practice of exegetical imagination and sacred imaginings as we do some text work together. And you will be, with the exception of people who've heard a couple of sermons that I've preached, the first people really to hear an academic or congregational presentation on material from this volume. All right. How many of you read, and this is no shame, and I'm not soliciting feel goods, but it helps me to know who's in the room. How many of you read or listened to me read it to you in Audible, Womanist Midrash? Okay, so this should make sense. The original introduction to Womanist Midrash included an invitation to supper. And I invite you, if you find it in a bookstore somewhere or one of your friends have it, to just read that much of the introduction and see if that doesn't get you into that book. As is often the case in my family and culture of origin, one such invitation, an invitation to supper, begets another. In fact, you may receive an open invitation from that point forward with the stipulation that you are family now. I don't know if that works in anybody else's house, that you come and you're a guest, and having done so, you're told by an elder in the home, well, you come on back and next week, you're family. So, you might wash dishes next week, or you might have to bring something next week, but this week, you don't have to do anything, but you understand that you have a perpetual invitation after that first invitation. And so you have a perpetual invitation to wrestle biblical texts with me. So you are welcome to this Womanist table, and I love this table right here. This Womanist table, whether you have sampled this cuisine or not. So whether you've read Womanist Midrash or heard me read it to you, whether you know what Womanist is or have done this type of biblical interpretation, you are all welcome to this table. And perhaps, and this is true for many of you, and I wrote this in this introduction for the second volume just for y'all, perhaps you missed that first supper. You are doubly welcome. While it is within the nature of people to continue conversations, even in the presence of folk who were not there the first time around, you have that happen? I'm trying to be better than that in this book, trying to be more inclusive than that. The conversations that will occur around the table this time are open to all. So there will be references to previous conversations, and some of the dishes that were served the last time will be served again, but there will also be entirely new dishes and conversations, and you are welcome to partake and bring your own. So that means I want to hear from you all in conversation and discourse and question. Womanist Midrash is an interesting title for a book. And anybody have any publishing experience in that genre? It is also a terrible title for a book because it includes two words that are not well known or easily recognized by the people I would like to pick the book up off the shelf and invest their hard-earned money. So at one level, it is ridiculous, but at another level, it is perfect. My bestie, Dr. Mark Brummett, gave this work its name when he heard an early draft in a lecture like this at a seminary in 2010. But unbeknown to us, distinguished professor of religions, Dr. Harold C. Washington, employed the term Womanist Midrash in 2000 in a section title to categorize the biblical exegetical work of Zora Neale Hurston, specifically her 1939 Moses, man of the mountain. So I accidentally fell into his lineage, and I am delighted by it. Here's what Dr. Washington wrote. Womanist Midrash, Hurston's approach to the Bible. In it, analyzing her biblically themed plays, he identifies Zora Neale Hurston's work as Womanist Midrash as doing the following: adapting biblical forms for humorous effect. The two students who have been with me know that I do that, and I didn't even know that I was following in the footsteps of Zora Neale Hurston. And signifying is Black cultural language that means to distinguish a word by how it is said, or even the cultural inflection. And as Black speech has become more, oh, I think I went out. Oh no, I'm back. As Black cultural speech has become more widespread, particularly Black, queer, and trans speech, folk signify without knowing it. Girl. It's an entire conversation depending on the inflection. Girl, 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 right? So much is inflected, and Dr. Vincent Hardin refers to the scriptures as a signifying book, and that goes back to African folk tales about the signifying monkey. So the ways in which we make meaning of things, often reading things in reverse, doing all kinds of cultural work while saying the same words as other people, but meaning entirely different things. So Zora Neale Hurston's Womanist Midrash signifies on both the foibles of African-American contemporaries and on the perils of defining Black culture in a very uneasy alliance with white patronage. And that speaks to me as a Black person who teaches in a primarily white institution and is priested in a primarily white church. So this uneasy relationship during which I signify on words that are used in the common discourse, but mean something quite different to me than are meant in the discourse. Dr. Washington situates Hurston as a serious student of Jewish texts, keenly interested in the creative freedom and organic intertextuality of Black folklore and midrashic literature alike. And as I say in this introduction, this description suits me as well. Feminists talk about rediscovering the reinvention of the wheel, that every once in a while we'll come across a manuscript or an artist or a poet or a historian or a nun, and we'll find out that in her writings, in her paintings, that she was using feminist God language before the rest of us, or she was doing, making a theological argument or commenting on history, but because her work was suppressed or she was shut up in the convent or her writings were burned, you know, we're rediscovering, and new feminists have made the argument in themselves without knowing that there was a foremother. So it's important for me to share this lineage, because the first time I did this work, I did not know I had this direct foremother. So for readers for whom womanism is new, I really like Dr. Karen Baker Fletcher's definition. The word womanist is a signifier of radical and revolutionary movement in Black women's scholarship since the 1980s. Radical and revolutionary. Womanism as a term and its early definition stems from the writings of Alice Walker. Her most familiar definition is one that you can easily look up, and some of you may be familiar of the one line that womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender. It's a sort of half-page definition, but she has an earlier definition with which many folk are less familiar, and it is: Womanist encompasses feminist as it is defined in Webster's, but also means instinctively pro-woman. At the time of her writing, this was true. It is not in the dictionary at all. Nonetheless, it has a strong root in Black women's culture. It comes to me, to Walker, from the word womanish, a word our mothers used to describe and attempt to inhibit strong, outrageous, or outspoken behavior when we were children. You acting womanish, a labeling that fails, for the most part, to keep us from acting womanish. A label, I read that part, that is to say, like our mothers themselves, like the women we admired. We were womanish as children because our mothers were womanish and our aunties were womanish. Now, particularly at this moment in time on our planet, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge, and it pains me greatly, Alice Walker's deep and unrepentant anti-Semitism. Womanism is founded on her writings and her original ideology and expression of womanist, but it is not in any way anti-Semitic, and it is not tied to her anti-Semitic writings. And so, having become aware of them in the same way that we acknowledge the land on which we stand and the implications of it, I must always acknowledge that. So if anyone goes to look up Alice Walker after having sat with me in study or teaching, they are prepared and know and have heard me explicitly repudiate that. My own writing and preaching, I define a womanist as a Black woman, and later I began to expand that to femme-identified non-binary people whose feminism is so rich, deep, thick, broad, and wide, it moves beyond the mere self-interest of paler feminisms to embrace the well-being of the whole community. Because as Walker says in her earliest definition, we are in the Black community, Black, brown, beige, yellow, pink, and white, and we are partnered with people in all of those shades, and we have children by birth and by heart in all of those shades. So when womanists are committed to the well-being of the entire Black community, that is a global commitment, because the entire planet is in our community. Womanism is brash, bold, and brazen like the forehead of a whore. I'll come back to that line. Womanism is womanish, and it talks back with a hand upon her hip. The reference to a forehead of a whore comes from Jeremiah. I had done this sermon on Rahab, and the title of the sermon, and my work is all available on willgafney.com. Feel free to use it as a scholarly and preaching resource, Bible study, videos, the thing. Just cite it and me when you use it. And I looked at the story of the two sneaky-footed people, because that's what the word spies means in Hebrew, is the footers. And we say that, what's the word? There's a word for foot troops, not just infantry. I'm losing my military discourse. But anyway, so the footers, and it says, you know, the spies went into Rahab's house and they lay down. They went in, they lay down. None of that is spying, and none of that is bringing back reports. They went in and they lay down. So the title of my sermon was, "Who you calling a whore?" So wrote that sermon, did that, preached that at an 8 o'clock service in a Black Baptist church, and I had to check with the pastor, who's a friend of mine. I was like, is this going to go over well? He's like, it's going to go great. Oh, my mom goes to that service. Like, oh, that's and it went well. And I adore her and she adores me. And I sit with her when I visit that church. So we're good. So I'm getting to this Jeremiah passage. I have no idea how I got to it, but as I prepare for my introduction to Hebrew Bible course, and now at the Bright Divinity, is Introduction to Interpreting the Hebrew Bible and Deuterocanonical apocryphal texts in context. As I prepare for my intros, I always read the Hebrew Bible all the way through, and so I find different things. And Jeremiah was saying that Israel's being bad, and yesterday, I always say yesterday for the previous thing, no matter how many days it was, and I use tomorrow in the same way, so I don't have to keep track. Yesterday at our Querying the Prophets conversation, we looked at these metaphors that are used to describe the relationship between God and Israel and why the marital relationship is really problematic. And so Jeremiah is saying, Israel, you're bad. You have the forehead of a whore. This is a bad thing. And I said, well, I don't know. I'm pretty stubborn myself. And people who know me deeply know that I was called into Christian ministry first as a teacher, which is why I argued with God when she said preaching. I said, no, we did that fast and you said teaching. Preaching and teaching go together. It's like, okay, I lost that argument. So when she came around later and said pastor, and I was like, okay, we're not even fighting about this anymore. But I was called through this scripture in Ezekiel that says, your forehead will be harder than their foreheads. So this is why I'm so combative. This is why I'm so combative on Twitter. Apparently it's constitutional and it's my spiritual call. But I say with all that text and that fast was how I came into ministry. So when I saw this passage in Jeremiah, I said, a hard head is a good thing. And that sermon about forehead of a whore turned into be the kind of woman that a preacher like Jeremiah will call a whore because you're making your own reproductive decisions. Be the kind of woman that some men will call the whore of Babylon because you stand in a pulpit. So be the kind of woman that somebody will say has the forehead of a whore. And so that got folded into my definition of womanism. And apparently I was not finished with whoredom because my best friend to whom I referred you, Dr. Mark Brummett, sent me a piece of the sermon he was working on, Hosea and Gomer and their children. God bless you. And he had this beautiful observation that while God is saying these things to Hosea, and then Hosea is saying them to Gomer, and sometimes God and Hosea are getting tangled up. Say to them, you're not my people. Say to them, you're not my child. Right? And what is Gomer doing? In the verse, she has just weaned Lo-Ami, the child called not my child. And Mark pointed out that they're arguing about how they're going to reject the people and the children. And Gomer is not rejecting the children. She's holding them to her breast and feeding them and cradling them and then weaning them as appropriate. And so that sermon turned into when Gomer looks more like God. So I wound up with this suite of whoredom sermons that shaped my understanding of womanism, and that's how that got folded into the definition. And so that is womanist Midrash, taking the text, taking it seriously, taking it literally, and then, as the rabbis do, the Midrash part, weaving new meanings out of those words without rejecting or denying the previous meanings. Oh, great. So I mentioned that Womanist Midrash is a type of exegetical imagination, that in the Black church context, it's the sanctified imagination. And that is a thing that preachers say when they are going to go beyond the text. You can be in the most conservative, the most literalist minded context. And when a Black preacher says, in my sanctified imagination, you know you're going to get a rich story about the text, behind the text. In my sanctified imagination, I see Joshua in his chariot leaning to the side on those big Iron Age stone 22s, checking out the latest model sundial. And, you know, right? So you tell the, and it can be fantastical. But the language of sanctified imagination lets your congregation know that you know the limits of the text in your world. And when it is framed that way, there's no rejection of it. And so preachers who are not literalists and might be in that context find ways to help the congregation go beyond. And you might say, I know it's not in there, but consider with me for a moment. What if Mary Magdalene really was an apostle? Right? So you can push people because of your rhetoric. You can engage in this act of sanctified imagination, and the rhetoric of question falls in it. Would you consider with me the possibility that a congregation will go a long way with that than if you tell them flat out, there is no evidence for the Exodus whatsoever, right? That's not going to be helpful to them. So as you do your imaginings around texts that I'm going to assign to you, because I'm a professor and I have to assign texts, I want you to draw out of your cultural context. And so that's why sanctified imagination is my language. That's the language of Black preachers. So think about what your language might be: word weaving, reimagining, dreaming with the text. In fact, let that be your first exercise. How will you talk about how you will think beyond the limits of the text and talk about it in your context? And I know you have multiple contexts. You have the context of your congregation or the community with whom you read and pray scripture. You have a cultural context. You have a gender and gender performance and orientation context that might be upfront for you. So think about how you would talk about how you're going to work with the words in the word. Type, write, think, dream, imagine. All right. Can you help me with our friends in Zoom? If you would put in chat some of your terms for your sacred imaginings, word weavings, I'd like to share them with the larger assembly. And while that's getting together, I will ask for some of those here in this room. Yeah, just raise your hand and the mic will come around. A simple 2 or 3 word phrase. How will you describe your work just for this moment in time?
Engaging, encountering, engaging, connecting, but more importantly, getting to the cultivating, like turning over like soil in engaging.
Cultivating.
Yeah.
Okay, I like it. Cultivating.
Trauma experience, marginalized, speaking up for on behalf of the voiceless.
Okay. Way back there.
Sorry, they can't hear you.
Yes, let us remember.
I think of it in terms of being a director, and I'm going to walk around in the world of the text, but I'm recasting, so like doing Hamlet in contemporary. So when I'm walking around in the world of the text, I try to think of it as I'm staging this play in a different context.
Staging in a different temporal and cultural context. And yes, Our loud voices are not enough because we want to make sure our friends on Zoom hear us well.
So Carlick Robinson on Zoom says, as a preacher, I use the term sanctified imagination. I also use the words I wonder from
I
Gafney
wonder.
play.
Yes. Wonderful. And after there, all the way up here by me.
When I was writing the lesson plan based on your profile for Holy Troublemakers and Unconventional Saints, I used for the children and youth, what is your God language, which is, I think, what you say to the children and or the students rather in your
Yes.
context. And I find that really helpful.
Yes.
Disrupting the binary between humans and nature.
Yes. Yes.
On Zoom, Nat Johnson offers inbreaking, hope, wonder. Gail Sandlin, respect and credibility, a different worldview. Abby D'Ambroso, beyond the borders of knowledge. And
Nice.
Deborah Anderson offers in other words.
In other words, oh yes, you can do some work with that. Well, the Jesus language, you have seen it written, but I say unto you. Take a couple more if there are.
I'm at the bedside of my brother-in-law who's in hospice, and our families, my husband and my family, use different language, and so I am just pulling out words that I want to emphasize. Love, I love you. Rest, imagine, care. Can I touch you? Can we hold hands? Silently or aloud. I imagine, I hope.
Thank you. All right, so I asked you all to have Bibles available, digital Bibles, physical Bibles. Is there anyone who does not have one and needs one from church resources? All right. We are going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 1. First Samuel chapter 1. And to remind you that this is the Hannah story. The background verses for the work we're going to do today are 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9 through 16. So make a note of that when I send you into groups and conversations. You will go back to that for resources or to text around. But what we're going to look at is the same story forward in chapter 2, verse 221. And we're going to work together on something called close reading. And I invite you, when you are doing your devotional reading, and many of you do this if you do Lectio Divina, but in any of your Bible study, sermon preparation, to take the time to read the text aloud. It aloud more than once and in more than one translation. Verse 221, And the Holy One attended Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Someone else, please read another translation. All the translations I will share with you are my own, of course. Ken and Steve, we are really going to put you to work running around with the mic. Someone, please. And if you would identify your translation.
This is the NRSV. And the Lord took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters.
Okay. Anyone else? Over here, I'm left, right, dyslexic. From reading languages that go in both language, my left, right thing doesn't work anymore.
And the Lord blessed Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew before the Lord.
And what translation, please?
George Lamassa's translation.
Oh, interesting. So that's the Peshitta, and that's from a completely different ancestral manuscript tradition. That's Syriac. So it's good to have that in the room. Kind of a cousin. And one, oh, okay.
I don't know.
Oh, right here, right where you are.
Oh, hi, Wendy. I have the JPS Tanakh. No, I've lost it. For the Lord took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Young Samuel, meanwhile, grew up in the service of the Lord.
Thank you. So we're focusing on Hannah's daughters. What kind of story can we tell about Hannah's daughters? And so that's why I asked you to take note of the larger Hannah story. And now I'm going to ask you.
One person.
Oh, do we have a different translation in the Zoom room?
Yeah.
Yes.
Janet? Janet Fisher? Hello, thank you.
Yes, that's me.
Oh, okay. What translation do you have, Janet?
The JPS Tanakh Gender Sensitive Edition, which
Oh,
is
awesome.
hot off the press.
Yes.
For God took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters.
Thank you. So.
I have a different one.
Okay, we'll take one more.
Okay, this is the message. God was most especially kind to Hannah. She had 3 more sons and 2 daughters. The boy Samuel stayed at the sanctuary and grew up with God.
So we're going to take a couple, by which I mean 10 minutes, in your tables, and the tables are enough, and I'll let you subdivide. And if anyone is by themselves and it's okay for you to come and be closer to people, please join a table. But if you need to sit a bit apart as we take care of our health and our well-being, manage yourselves, you know what's best for you. I'll just let you subdivide in maybe 4-ish online, and let's go into a 10-minute study and confab to think about Hannah's daughters in terms of Hannah's story, and dream a dream, weave a vision. Tell me something about Hannah's daughters. All right, let us come back together. I love the energy. I love the energy. I see some laughing on the screen and some smiling. Good, because I want it to be across every state and territory where we all are. And let me also ask loudly over the mic, as I do, as a matter of hospitality, for a tissue or two. I'm being a little sniffly over here. So starting with our friends on Zoom, give me 3 points in a poem, as we say in Black church preaching. Give me just a couple of notes of what you want to say or dream or imagine about Hannah's daughters. Right, but I'm asking it for comments in the Zoom window.
Okay.
Yes.
How did the daughters feel about the yearly visit to their oldest brother who didn't live with them?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
We imagined the sisters and Samuel telling the stories that we don't get to hear in the scriptures. You know, Samuel complaining to them about how he hates his boss.
Complaining about, I did not hear.
How he hates his boss.
He hates his boss. Yeah. Got chores. Oh, my chores are worse than your chores. You're not cleaning up after animal sacrifice. You're just cleaning up after mom in the kitchen. Oh, I could run a mile with that, a country mile. Others here?
It took us a moment to get to the right scripture and to discuss it. And I focused on that scripture and didn't read anything into it, except that there's two ways it could go. The daughters could feel that they were excluded, not cared about, as well as the daughters could understand that Hannah was barren and that God blessed Hannah to have them so that they would be in a precious, a more close relationship, as opposed to them feeling rejected because of Samuel's position.
Yes, that's quite a family story to have. I went to high school with a girl whose story was, my mother prayed to the Virgin to get pregnant, and she promised if she had a girl, she would name her Mary, and that was a story she told. All right, so I withheld a verse from you, and I'm going to give you that verse, and we're going to do a little more work. But before we went to break, I heard someone perhaps at this table say something about names. Was that perhaps you?
Yeah. We don't know their names.
We don't know their names. One of the long-standing practices of rabbinic Midrash, the classical ancient Midrash, is to provide names for characters who don't have them. And while nobody could call the rabbis feminists, they were often bothered by the number of women who did not have names, and they supplied them. Now, I don't have names for these daughters, and if I had written a whole Midrash or a chapter about them, I might have given them names, which is something I do following the rabbis. And before I got to my rabbinic education, I saw some feminist biblical scholars doing it. Again, we don't always know the history before us. So this is a practice that has lots of legs under it. And when I name a character, I take a look at the language. So for example, I named Pharaoh's daughter in the first book. So I looked at Egyptian names, and you can find a lot of stuff on the internet, and you have to have a discerning spirit about it. But there are these onomastica, which is what scholars call name lists. And you can find a list of Philistine names and Hittite names and Egyptian names. So I would often take a name from a list, and if it's a particularly scholarly one, that will say, you know, this is a Middle Bronze Iron Age name, and it was on a piece of papyri or on a broken pottery sherd. So for me, that grounds me in the practice. And I also would name the character after something special, like the last sister who spoke. So maybe we would name them Blessing and Precious, right? Name them out of how they fit in the story, which goes back to, I think it was Wendy who said, moving around on me, who brought up how I invite my students to name God. Who is God in this passage? The bestower of blessing, but perhaps also the withholder of blessing, right? So here's the verse I did not give you because I thought it was kind of an easy setup, but you could have read backwards and found it. No blame, I'm just saying I held it back on purpose. And that's the verse right before our shared verse, and it's 8. Hannah's husband Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart sad? I am now reading the NRSV because I did not translate this verse in my work. Am I not more to you than 10 sons? Now let's go back to those daughters. And I end my discussion of Hannah and her daughters with this observation. How would Hannah's daughters have heard their father's words? Am I not worth more to you than this number of sons? I said 3 daughters. It's 2 daughters and 3 sons, right? Make a note to fix that in the manuscript. I invented a whole new daughter. Her 2 daughters are almost lost in Hannah's story. What life lessons did Hannah pass on about God, prayer, and desperation, and in the cultural circumstances in which they found themselves, judged by their reproductive fruitfulness and subject to an unwanted plural marriage? Now, what none of you brought up in your whole entire 10 minutes to research and put all of your thoughts in order was that Hannah's daughters were in a complicated 2-mother system, sister-wife system, where there was bitter rivalry. And Peninnah had lots of children. Were there fights between these children? What was that family dynamic like for the kids? I leave you with that, and I move on to a character in the story. We had the comment about Samuel and his boss and rift on the chores. Who is Samuel's primary caregiver after he's weaned? Eli. Anybody missing? I have always wondered if Eli's unnamed wife was alive when he began to foster Samuel. Eli has children that show up in the story, and they are some rapscallions, and that's not even the word for them. Thugs, rapists, thieves. So I've always wondered if Eli's unnamed wife was alive when he began to foster Samuel, if she served as a foster mother for Samuel. Because their 2 sons, Eli and the unnamed woman, have Egyptian names, some have speculated that she was Egyptian herself. Another African woman woven into the fabric of Israel. Remember that Joseph's wife, Asenath, is Egyptian. And There will not be reckoned a tribe of Joseph, so to speak. That language actually only occurs in the Hebrew Bible about 2 or 3 times. But Joseph's 2 sons will be elevated to patriarchs, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so those are half African tribes that descend from them, and they're all Afro-Asiatics anyway, right? So now we have this woman, but it's all, let's see. It may well be that we are to read her absence from the story as absent from its world. That is, that Eli raises Samuel on his own, and that his son's wildness, thuggishness, thievery, rape, occurs in her absence. But it's also possible that she's very much alive, helping Eli raise this just weaned little boy who's little more than a baby when his mother brings him to the aging priest as the surrogate of God. It's possible that Eli's wife was aware of and heartbroken by the conduct of her own sons. Whoever she was, however long she lived, whether Samuel ever met her or not, she was there between and behind the lines of the text, nearly, but not completely erased. So close reading as a practice of biblical interpretation exegesis is certainly not limited to womanist work or feminist, but it's about asking the questions: who's there, who's not there, and what are the resulting issues and questions. I believe we have uploaded in some way the handout with the questions for doing biblical interpretation. I don't know why I keep looking at you, Steve. Right, so I'd like to hand them out here and also put those questions in the text, in the chat. And this is a list of helpful questions to ask of a text when you are studying, writing a sermon, writing a paper, doing work. I tell my students not to try to write their paper by going through every question, because that'll get you up to a dissertation. And in some cases, every question cannot be answered in a particular passage. But it is a way of getting in and thinking deeply when you don't necessarily know what questions to ask. And don't overlook the basics, the who, what, where, why, when, and the how. Those 6 of who, what, where, when, why, how is present, and the who, what, where, why, when, how is missing or between the lines, like Eli's wife. So take a moment and look at those, and I'm going to key up what's next for us. All right, we are going to go to Judges chapter 11. And we're going to read the first 3 verses. And I'm going to have you read them a little bit hushed in this room in your groups with the different versions you have among you. And I'm going to have you read them together online. So this should probably take not more than 5 minutes to read and acknowledge the differences in the translations around your tables. Just 3, chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. All right. Not to do a Matthew McConaughey impression. It's the wrong accent for that. Friends and kin. Let me ask you the question that may be hanging over these verses for some of you. What do you know about the biblical character Jephthah? What do you know? Do we have a mic runner? Yes. What do we know? Does anybody know anything about Jephthah? Jennifer? Oh, the other Jennifer. We have several, we have more than one
You want
Jennifer.
the other one? That's fine.
Yeah, that I was calling
Oh, okay.
my previous Jennifer.
I'm the previous Jennifer. Jephthah, yeah, he's a military guy and he wants to win, and he makes this vow to God that God didn't even ask him for, and he says he will sacrifice whoever, if you let me win, he'll sacrifice whoever comes out of the door, and it's his daughter. And you gotta wonder, did he knew what he was doing? I don't know. Anyway, so he sees his daughter come out of his home, and then he blames her. You're the one who brought me this low. And because he wants to fulfill the vow to God that he made that God didn't even ask him for.
So the story of Bat Yiftach, Jephthah's daughter, is one of the most brutal stories, horrific stories in the Hebrew Bible. The way that the book of Judges is set up, it has other horrific stories, including the butchering of the Levite's secondary wife, including attempted genocide of the tribe of Benjamin, extermination of the city of Yaves Gilad, abduction and sexual trafficking of girls to repopulate the tribe of Benjamin when they decide they want them back. A bizarre line in that story when somebody finally objects to the madness in a verbal framework that would almost make sense in our world. Well, what do we say to their fathers and brothers when we go girl napping? I'm like, okay, so we're on the same planet now. And they give them a speech and say, well, we didn't take enough women when we went women stealing the last time. And I want to say to the characters, authors, and editors, if you had the framework that somebody's going to say, this might not go over well. If you had that consciousness, how could that be your response to this is not going over well? Just recite this speech. That's not going to happen. So in the book of Judges, we have these horrific stories, lots of physical and sexual violence. But the book of Judges is redeemed for me and for many other because it has this refrain. In those days, people did what was right in their own eyes. So the editorial voice of Judges is basically saying, this is bad. Look at this people. They're terrible. Now, what the editorial voice of Judges thinks will sort them out is a whole nother issue. In those days, everyone did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel. I'm sorry, have you seen monarchy in the Iron Age? What about your neighbors makes you think that a monarch is going to mean that people are not butchering their relatives and neighbors? But that is the framework. It's a pro-monarchical text. So it's doing that work. Now, so Jephthah is this character person who commits this horrific act of violence, and it becomes religious violence because it's in the category of, he doesn't say God said for me to do it, but he does it as a religious act. So womanism calls us to tend the entire community. And I have a prayer that I pray when I get to this point about praying for those who, the victims and the victimizers, the perpetrators, and those who are preyed upon. Praying for all the people, including those we may not want to pray for because we are so offended by the horror of their acts. And when I preach on Cain and Abel, I talk about the fact that there's such a high incarceration rate for Black folk, Black women and Black men. And so much of that stems from injustice and white supremacist superstructures. But it is also the case that people in prison are guilty. And they are still our sons and cousins and fathers and husbands and partners and friends and nephews. So Jephthah is in the family. And I gave you these 3 verses, knowing that some of you might know this is a person who many people want to drop kick out of the text and out of the family and out of the story. To not ask so much, how did he get, but as we often do in the criminal justice system, talk about what cultural, emotional, psychological resources have. Someone once said that coping mechanisms are a luxury, right? That some people are in a context where there's not a discourse or reflection about what's a better coping mechanism for my anger or my hurt or my pain. They do the thing they know how to do that everyone around them does, and that's what they do. And it may be horrific. So that was the background. As with the last text, I wanted you to go into it without me setting you up too much. So tell me some of what resonated with you and how you would tell a story of this pre-notorious Jephthah, this pre-society has turned their back on him, right? What do you see in these 3 verses that you might want to weave a story about, imagine? Here, and help me look for hands in the Zoom room as well.
Well, Jephthah loved his mother. He didn't really know as a little kid what a prostitute was. He just knew he loved his mother. She loved him. She was all he had. But what he didn't understand was why everybody, as they went down the street, would spit at her, and why all these different men kept coming to visit her at night. And as he got older and the other boys started picking on him and bullying him because of who his mother was, he became more and more aggressive, both for himself and her and for his mother.
Yeah,
and that led to him becoming a warrior.
So there's a real story about how he's treated by the other sons, which is in the text, and not hard to imagine how else he might be treated. Over here, please, Wendy.
I think when I read the part about him being driven away and then being brought back in and then making this unnecessary vow, I sort of see him internalizing the culture and saying, oh, I have to be like extra pious, extra religious, and I have to do the things that culture is done because now I'm part of the system, and he didn't even need to do it. So sort of like you internalize the dominant culture's values, and then he says, oh, I'm going to make this unnecessary sacrificial vow, and doesn't have to, and it pays for it. And he was fine just the way he was, but because he had been driven away and abandoned, he couldn't see it.
I'm going to come back to that driven away point, but this idea that you are never good enough, sometimes in a transracial adoption or the first college student that of your family or generation, you are or the person who's converted, who is like suddenly more, Episcopalian than, right, Kramer or whatever, that I have to fit in, I have to be this, I have to do this. Was there another hand before I respond? Yes, thank you.
Just briefly, the conversation at our table also picking up on the themes that you've described and how it informs even our cultures today is how the language that we use to destroy someone's self-esteem, like illegitimate or bastard child, go deep into that person's psyche and how it manifests out in their life, across their lives.
Now, so let's talk about the driving away. What's the opposite of driving away? I'm embracing.
Deborah Anderson has her hand
Deborah.
raised.
Go ahead, Deborah, and I'll come back to mine.
Deborah?
Yes, I am. I guess I had a little different spin looking at the idea of lineage and inheritance. So his brothers say, Neener, 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 you don't have the legacy. Judaism is a matriarchal thing. So he went out and created his own legacy, and he took the vow. He did what everybody else was doing, was vowing to God, but didn't have the resources to do it in maybe a righteous way, in the traditional concept of righteousness.
Okay.
So I don't see him as such a bad guy. I see him as using what he had, trying to get what other people had.
Okay.
Anyway, for what it's worth.
Okay, I appreciate that. And this is a hard conversation to have because we really didn't look at that later part. I know depending on the audience that some people can be more or not familiar with that. So that made that complicated. But now let me retrench a couple of things. It's important to note that there is no Judaism in this passage. There's no Judaism in the Hebrew Bible until the establishment of the Second Temple in 508. So we're going to be in the books of Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, and Nehemiah before we can begin to talk about Judaism. Ancient Israelite religion is patriarchal. You are an Israelite if your father is an Israelite. There is no matrilineal lineage until the medieval period. It is all patriarchal in the Afro-Asiatic world, and that's why rape is a tool of war and genocide, because kill the men, kill the baby boys, seize the women and preteen girls, rape and impregnate them, and then the children they give birth to are the children of the conquering force. So it's important to sort of get our historical periods lined up, and that's difficult with Hebrew Bible when you're not a specialist, and also the text covers more than 1,000 years. Which is why I always say I need a three-semester intro. I mean, what is in the New Testament? What is it, 12 pages? Come on, I got a millennium. I got stuff to teach. So I want to go back to this driving out and gathering in. Yiftach is the son of a sex worker, a woman he knows. Gilead, who has his own lineage, that's a great term, thank you for bringing that in, has a wife who society recognizes with some dignity. Now, everybody knows not just that Gilead has an outside child, but that Gilead has a sex worker habit. How is Gilead's wife feeling about that, right? Polygamy is, I won't say normative, but it's tolerated, particularly around the high-ranking thing. Isn't it interesting how the wealthy have a set of behaviors that other people don't have? So class is as important an angle for analysis in Hebrew Bible as gender, because when you get polygamy among rich folk, not poor folk. So you've got Gilead's wife, knowing that Gilead is not only having sex with sex workers, but making at least one baby with a sex worker, and that child is known and in her life and in her face. So just as Jephthah's mother is getting, spit at, called out down the street, Gilead's wife is getting the treatment from some other people, right? Her husband had that child with that woman who's on the corner. So you got that whole thing. So these women are just set up at loggerheads. When his sons with his wife grew up, they drove him out. That means at some point, Jephthah was taken from his birth mother in his household with this woman who probably did not want to raise the prostitute's son in the first place, and her sons with their anger and resentment. And as soon as they were big enough, when they grew up, they put him out. He loved his mother, as you said. That's how I wrote this story. He loved his mother and was torn, screaming from her arms to a woman who didn't want him, didn't like him. And so what emotional well-being, spiritual well-being, psychological well-being, what resources did he have to draw on to parent? And in story, there is no wife or mother. So how can we not be surprised that a child with this raising, who then, whether it's to establish his own lineage and his own stuff, work out his own spirituality, his own way, because whatever he's doing, he didn't want to do it that way, that he runs with thugs and outlaws, is insecure because he had actually won that battle, and then he makes the vow. And then he commits this horrific act against his child later. So in those 3 verses is a whole lot. A whole lot. So as you all took a look at those particular questions, if you were going to do a longer form study of this and even up to the brutality that exists, what are some of the questions that you would want to ponder or write on, journal on, weave into a blog or newsletter entry, a sermon, or a Bible study with regard to this chapter? What questions would you like to engage from that list? Yes, please let us use the mic.
Well, in some ways, I was thinking about the role of a prostitute in that time and maybe the greater independence or freedom that person would have. Just because there would have been prostitutes in temples as well, right?
Actually, that's a fiction of Herodotus.
Okay.
That's a whole thing.
But my question is, would they be allowed to keep their own money?
Yes, there is. Yes.
So
So your notion of independence, absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess my question would be, what are the power dynamics in the narrative?
Yeah. And even not knowing that, going back to that language we talked about, sanctified imagination, I wonder if by being a sex worker, that meant she had a freedom Israelite women didn't normally have. I wonder if that meant she could keep her money. I wonder if she's even Israelite, you know, so that you can wondering and questioning and some of the word weaving we did earlier. And as I tell my students, very much like a legal argument, you can't say that's the case unless you have evidence and I want a footnote. But if you say, I've been wondering if this was possible, get away with almost anything in the paper, right? As long as you frame it in such a way that you're not making a declarative statement about something for which you have no evidence. Yeah. What's another question? And I'm also looking at the screen that might get your juices going on this story.
Well, going the other way, I wondered, since there's no question of who Jephthah's father is, did Jephthah's father make his mother a prostitute by that action? And why did he not marry her as a second wife?
Yes, there's some questions there, including, is he keeping her and setting her up so she doesn't have any other male customers, any other customers, or is she in some way reserved for him? So this is a longer term thing, because
or was she sentenced to this? If maybe she became a prostitute because of that relationship in the child.
That's interesting. That's a great question, because and I can see the rabbis doing that kind of thing. Was she a sex worker first? Did she have the child and then she was a sex worker? So you could sort of weave it and then you could tell it both ways. That's something I like to do in this volume. So for example, I tell the story from Hannah's perspective, and then I tell the story from Penina's perspective. And I did that with Rachel and Leah in the first volume. So you could absolutely do a sermon where you start it one way and then you say, but what if? And we don't know. And do the other way, because however you build it out to the contemporary world, there are always going to be people who identify with it both ways. So that's a great set of questions. Thank you. Looking for those little yellow hands. All right, I don't
Yeah.
see any.
Online, Abby wrote, does Jephthah look just like his father?
Oh, yes, that's a powerful emotional trigger that every time you see that child. And what if her children, the wife's children, took after her side of the family, and only that child has the father's dimple or whatever? Yeah. Anyone else? Well, I will call us into break. It is 10:42. I'm terrible at mathing. Can we come back at 5 minutes to 11? Hello, as we are gathering together, I saw a bit of a question up on the comments from our friends and kin in Zoom. So the way that religious communities tell their stories is not always the way that scholars tell their stories. And so it is very common for conservative and progressive Jewish communities and speakers to use the language of Judaism to talk about the events in the Hebrew Bible, because it is a long and continuing tradition, and the contemporary tradition, of course, goes back to ancient Israelite religion. And that is a technical term that you're not going to hear in synagogue. So it will be normative to hear people talking about Judaism as a single uninterrupted phenomena. So some people express hearing different language. In terms of the shift from patrilineal to matrilineal, it's even more complicated because you have lineality and locality, and another piece. Lineality is, again, what identifies you as a person, as a member of the community. And so there's a great irony with King that it is not being sufficiently Jewish. His mother was Jewish, but that was insufficient because there had not been the switch. So there's a variety of discourses about how the switch happened, but what is underneath the switch is the vulnerability of Jewish people time to violence by their Christian host nations and Christian neighbors and other peoples, pogroms, violent attacks. And so there is an understanding among scholars, Jewish and at some point, there's a critical point at which identity has to be reckoned differently if the people are to survive and be able to be named in that way. So it's not a particular sort of tractate in the Talmud or Mishnah where the rabbis sort of, convene a Beit Din and make a decision, but it comes in. And in terms of locality, there's multiple frameworks in the Hebrew Bible. So you have the language in Genesis, therefore a man will leave his parents and join with his wife. That is matrilocality, that the new branch of the family is set up on the mother's side away from in fact, you have Isaac moves Rebecca into his mother's tent. But you also have patrilocality, where the family expands around the patriarchal lineage. Then you have the family system is reckoned in two ways. You've probably seen the language of the father's household. Those are patriarchal households, but there's also maternal households. For example, in the same, this is still the Rebecca marriage story. No, we're moving up to, yes, it is, because I mix up Rachel and Rebecca completely. When Laban, who is the mother of Rachel and Leah, identifies himself, he identifies himself as Ben Milcah, the son of Milcah, his mother. So he is doing maternal naming. So you've got lineality, you've got location, and you've got naming. But this is a good opportunity to talk about the Israelite social structure. Because when you say words like family, and not that we're not in this period, but in terms of legally, we went through a whole big thing about co-marriage, right? And what's a family and what's a household? And was it Mr. Rogers? One of these things is not like the other. Okay. I'm making 3 concentric circles, or round things pretending to be circles, semi-round things. So the innermost circle is the Beit, and you all know that word from Bethlehem, household. And it's either the Beit Emma, or Abba. That's the Aramaic, or Av, A-B. In the same way that the governor was once a gubernatorial candidate, and the B and the V switch sounds, that happens in Hebrew. So a Beit Em or Beit Av is the smallest recognizable social unit. If you're anything smaller than that, is just loose people, traveling, lost. And so that is what I call senior parents, that you might think of as grandparents, with, but it's centered around the child producing couple. So there is an adult child producing couple, and one of their parents, depending on matrilineality or patrilocality, all of that. So adult child producing unit with one set of parents. There are however many children, but also their siblings' children. And you might have that widowed aunt, or that uncle who was disabled in the last war, or the traitor who is the stranger within your gates, who's responsible for some of the commands of Torah. So it is, in the pre-COVID days, your Thanksgiving table, right? Because you might have several in-laws and outlaws and all the joy that goes with that. And the cousins, the kids get the cousins. So that is a household. 2 adults with children constructed by any kind of way, a dog named Spot and a picket fence, is not a family. We haven't even gotten to a family. That's just a household. The next unit, the mishpacha, M-I-S-H-P-A-C-H-A-H, mishpacha. That is family, and sometimes translated as clan in the Hebrew Bible. That's everybody who comes to your grandmother's funeral, because it's all the other Thanksgiving tables come together. That's what a family is. And so when we hear our Gazan dear ones saying whole families have been wiped out, that's what they mean. Like, there is no longer a Smith entry in the phone book, because everybody in the Smith lineage at that line, because they live co-locally, patrilineal or matrilineal, co-locally. Then the larger one is the tribe. So when the Hebrew Bible says something about a family, that's what a family is. And when the text talks about children, it's complicated because as in our world, we use the word children to mean minors. But we also acknowledge our adult children are still our children. And you know, your 50-year-old child might be your baby, right? And they may be a grandparent. So you've got that same complication. But in terms of address to children as moral subjects and ethical agents expected to be responsible for Torah, it means adults. It doesn't mean minors. So you and your in-laws living with your parents, honor your mother and father that your days may be long, right? All of those commandments are about a bunch of adults living together under houses much smaller than ours, right? It's kind of the let's get through Thanksgiving without killing anybody. Well, let's get through every day without killing anybody. And that's also why the sexual avoidance codes were so specific, because your nieces are coming to sexual maturity right under your house, under your nose. There's not separate bedrooms. People are aware of each other's sexual activity. It's all right, remember you're all a family, and none of that. Okay. So welcome back. I know that's an interesting departure, but you know, this also leads into the second handout, and you can begin to circulate that, is, you know, what are the resources you can bring to this work, and what are specifically the resources you already have that will help you to do this work. And so one, of course, is knowledge of background stuff, and you know, I'm going to have a different set of knowledge than you have. But I would invite you to think about what's on your shelf and what's on your digital shelf. What are your go-to resources? So I'm giving you a little quiz, because I can't do any kind of talk or presentation without giving somebody a quiz, that you might write out your resources, focusing particularly on study of scripture with female characters. I'm going to invite you all to share some of your resources. I'll name some other resources for you. And I don't see, oh, I do see Ken and Jennifer. I take it it's been typed in the Zoom chat box. So this is going to be more of maybe a 10-minute writing, note-taking exercise. Yes, 10 minutes, thank you. All right, I do know that the questions were, had a heavy preaching slant, but also for other ways of engaging the text. So somebody tell me some of your go-tos. If you want to get some background, whether you are a person who delivers the word in any way, or you just want to know what is going on.
Yeah, so I was ordained, graduated from seminary almost 30 years ago, and we had the basic biblical feminist scholars or theologians back then. More recently, I had a hard time. We had the women's commentary that wasn't very helpful to me because it was so sparse, and I didn't have the Womanist Midrash in my last years in ministry. So I really did a lot of online searching because there are more contemporary voices.
Okay.
And Debbie Thomas is an important, she's not an academic, but Journey with Jesus, she had wonderful perspectives and illustrations. And I would read a lot of sermons, and I'd have to fact check. I'd have to make sure that some of the messages that I resonated with me were accurate as I could get it. So it was a challenge is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And as they say, things get better. The Women's Bible Commentary has been revised, and it really is quite good. So it's a very useful volume now. to speak ill of the previous one, but things get better. Someone else. Okay, but all right. We're going to have you dancing when
online. Heidi says the Reverend Dr. Will Gafney lectionary series, exclamation point.
Okay. Okay, a women's lectionary for the whole church.
I would name Amy Jo Levine as well.
Mhm.
And Phyllis Tribble are the two, I mean, different generations, I
Yes.
think, but
And Dr. Levine has both her books as well as a website that is very useful. And back over here was the next person. And then at the far side of the room.
The Wisdom Bible Commentary.
The
Wisdom
Bible Commentary.
Yeah. The one that you mentioned on Thursday, it's great.
Oh,
the Wisdom.
Yes, the Wisdom Commentary series.
The Wisdom Commentary series.
The word Bible wasn't in the title, and so I was thinking, did I miss one? Did I miss one?
No.
So-
And for Jewish JTS org online and Safaria can be very helpful.
Yes. So the Wisdom Commentary series is a relatively new commentary series. It is the first academically rigorous feminist biblical commentary series with womanist scholars and feminist scholars and other women and men scholars of color. It's just about completed. It's 70 volumes. Safaria.org is a wonderful website where you can access the biblical texts and lots of the rabbinic literature. What was the other one you said? Oh, JTS, which is the seminary website. Yes? Yes. And yes, over here.
I put down Bishop Yvette Flunder as one, and then just like my Black elders.
Right. So community wisdom. Let us not neglect our elders, whether they're elders we have immediate access to in our communities, or those who are like parents. And Mother Bishop, as one of mine as well. She has taught me to say that Paul is my colleague, not my instructor, and sometimes I need to correct him, right? She says a version of that. She says it better. But. So please. And what's happening over here on this side of the room? Okay.
I'm one of three girls and my 95-year-old mother's living. So 4 strong women. And also a writing group, which is 4 women. We meet monthly. And then when I got to the women-focused text, I just loved writing down the women that I have read most recently. God is a Black Woman by Christina Cleveland, Cy Montgomery, Good Pig, Barbara Kingsolver, Demon Copperhead, Toni Morrison, Bluest Eye, and Recitative, and Ann Patchett, Tom Lake.
Thank you. I do an assignment in one of my courses where I ask them to make a new canon, and students bring in fiction and nonfiction and poetry and music, all of these things that are canonical resources. And don't forget music, the songs that we sing that get us over, hymn lyrics, gospel lyrics.
As someone who is not raised Christian and just sort of came in to the Episcopal Church a year and a half ago, the Bible Project podcast online has been really helpful. The Evolving Faith community and their conference has been a great resource for me. And the Radix group here at St. Mark's was great because I got to say yes. Just this week, we were discussing stories of women in the Hebrew Bible. So
awesome.
Those were the big things on my list.
Okay. Let me give you a few more and then we'll move on to at least one, maybe 2 readings, depending on how the time works. As I said to the other group, the Jewish Study Bible is irreplaceable for having good scholarly contextual commentary on the Hebrew Bible in its native context. And as a partner volume, the Jewish Annotated New Testament. For those wanting more information about women, whether it's a character who has a name or a character who does not have a name like Eli's wife, the Women in Scripture Dictionary covers women by their names or by chapter and verse when the names are lacking. The longer name is a dictionary of women in the Hebrew Bible, Deuterocanonical texts, and New Testament. This part, a dictionary of named and unnamed women in the Hebrew Bible, Deuterocanonical text, and New Testament. But Women in Scripture and Carol Myers will get you to there. Let's see. I'm trying to think, is there anything else top of mind? Oh, I know, I wanted to go over Bibles with you. The NRSV, the NRSV UE, the updated edition, the JPS Tanakh. Yesterday we had in the house the Inclusive Bible, which is useful, the brand new gender-sensitive Tanakh, expanded from the gender-sensitive Torah that I have, and maybe mine will meet me at home because I ordered one at the Society of Biblical Literature. The Common English Bible, and then I run out of Bibles. That's it. That's pretty much it. So you all have some great resources among you, and I also commend to you the Queer Bible Commentary in its most recent publication, although the previous iteration, just like the Women's Bible Commentary, sometimes it's useful to have both editions, because of course sometimes there are essays that go in and essays that come out, and you want to hold on to those. And there's also, if you take the word queer and make it, you sort of add a Y in parentheses and put an ing on it, querying Torah, goes through the Torah portions. Oh, yes, Jennifer. No, I know it's Torah queries, but there's also another querying Torah thing. Okay. That second one I'm whiffy on, but thank you, Jennifer, because Torah queries is a thing. And then Torah.org and thetorah.org are both useful websites. The Bible for Normal People podcast.
Yes.
And there's more. I would say basically, if I've been on the podcast, I trust it. So you have to do one of those weird Google Gafney podcasts and see what happens. Because I have not been on a podcast after which I said, do not talk to these people. That has never happened. All right. Oh, yes. So that's what the Jewish Study Bible and Jewish Annotated New Testament, that's the category for those. I will also add to that Everett Fox as the translator of the 5 books of Moses, and the early prophets is what he calls the former prophets. That's Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. He's got wonderful thick notes and introductions and articles as well. But because he does chunks, you don't get the whole Tanakh. But wonderful translation. So with your permission, I'd like to do at least one reading, but I think we can do 2 because it's noon and maybe a little bit because we wandered in a little bit. Although when you have to leave, you have to leave. And I will not hold you to like 2 or anything, but I might hold you to noon 012. 1 Kings 17:9. Get up, go now, Elijah, to Zarephath, which is part of Sidon, and settle there. See, now I have commanded a widow woman there to feed you. With one significant exception, widows only occur in kings in the statistical background information of two prominent men, and there are only two of them. Hiram, the great copper and bronze smith whose creations adorned the temple, lost his father at some point, presumably after he apprenticed with him. After a brief statement that Solomon summoned him and received Hiram from Tyre in 1 Kings 7:13, the very next piece of information relayed about him is that he was the son of a widow woman. The term widow, almanah, usually occurs alone, but in a handful of texts concentrated in Samuel and Kings, it is accompanied by woman. What is not said in this introduction is as interesting as what is said. For example, it is not stated directly that his father died to explain why the young coppersmith was given the commission. Introducing him as the son of an internationally renowned artisan would present him with status. Introducing him as the son of a widow woman presents him with some vulnerability. In likelihood, this introduction functioned to present Solomon as a gracious king, invoking classical categories of orphan and widow. In 1 Kings 11:26, the widow Zeruiah is introduced as part of the royal resume for her son, Jeroboam, the first monarch of the separatist Judah. In contrast, the widow of Zarephath is a full-fledged character with a voice, yet she has no name. Elijah has a religious name. The Holy One is my God. I'm using the Holy One here to represent the most sacred name of God, represented by the four letters YHWH, which we do not pronounce or attempt to pronounce, even though you might see them spelled out in some literature with vowels in them, because it's a great offense to Jews, and it is not, in fact, God's name. At best, it's a scholarly guess, and it comes out of a very anti-Semitic period of pre-Nazi German biblical post-Enlightenment scholarship. So Elijah's name means the Holy One is my God. So I have given the widow of Zarephath a comparable name, an attested Phoenician name. And I talked to you about how I would go and look up names from the periods. Uma Astarte. Astarte is my mother. Uma Astarte comes into the text in an otherwise unrecorded conversation or encounter with God. God tells Elijah in 1 Kings 17:9 that God has commanded a widow woman, with no further description, to provide for him. That conversation and her response are lacking. I shall provide them, as the concluding Midrash for this portion. Uma Astarte is at the gate of her community, a marginal liminal space. Without knowing the location of her home and its distance from the gate, I imagine that she has gone a long way to the very edge of her comfortable and familiar space, looking for scraps of firewood. She is gathering sticks, suggestive of a lack of proper firewood, or perhaps diminished strength due to hunger, or both. Reading from her perspective, an unknown traveler approaches Uma Astarte and asks for some water. It is the least she can do to meet the minimal standards of hospitality. As she goes to get him a cup of water, he calls out after her and asks for something to eat, a small piece of bread. His request highlights the leanness of her hospitality. She has not invited him to sit or rest. She has not offered him food or water to wash his feet. She has not inquired after his well-being. Not all of these things were beyond her material resources. Given what she so subsequently disclosed, it may simply be that her well was dry, the well of her soul. She has no prepared food to offer. She has only the meanest of ingredients, a dab of flour, and a dollop of oil, enough to make one cake that she will divide between herself and her child. And then she expects to die, likely of starvation. Nothing she says indicates that she has received a command from God, raising the question if the reader is supposed to imagine that God commanded her without her being aware of it. Indeed, she does as Elijah bids in verse 16, but she does not mention God. Though in verse 12, she responds to Elijah using the very proper name of God. How did she learn it? Did she actually have this conversation with God? Or did she merely recognize Elijah's appearance, clothing, accent as Israelite? I argue against the latter because the distinctions between Israelite and Canaanite were thin. Indeed, many understand Israelite to be a subgenre of Canaanite. Elijah prophesies to this widow woman in a country that is hers and not his, in the name of a God that is his and not hers, the God of Israel. He is an Israelite from the otherwise unknown Tishbe of Galilee. She is a Sidonian. Zarephath was a daughter city of Sidon, itself a coastal city on the Phoenician shelf of the Mediterranean, a valuable length of coastline that neither David nor Solomon had been able to take from the Phoenicians. To go to Zarephath was in effect to leave Israel, to go off the grid, to go on the run and go to the beach. Womanist inquiry examines social economics as well as gender and race, or in the case of ancient societies, inter-ethnic conflict, because of course there is no notion of race in the ancient world. And a womanist reading of this passage might note that the people who go to the beach are often of a higher socioeconomic status than some of the people who live in beach towns. The widow of Zarephath lived in a prime real estate location, but did not have two sticks to rub together and make a fire. Sharte and her son were food insecure. She had a home. She was the mistress of the house in verse 17, yet she was house poor, possessing little to nothing beyond her home. Elijah did not know Sharte. He did not know her need. He was there to have his needs met. Elijah comes into this passage, into this town, and into this woman's life, the beneficiary of divine provision in the previous verses. Having been instructed to have a nap and wake up to a snack, Elijah is sent on his way to this poor widow woman that she might provide for him on the next stage of his journey. Her needs will be met as the sequela to his needs being met. This story is dangerous in the world that reads the text. There are no small number of religious leaders who call upon vulnerable, impoverished congregants, mostly women, to give all they have and cannot afford to a church and its ministries with the promise that their needs will be met only after they have given like this widow, or the widow in Mark 12:42, duplicated in Luke 21:2. Starte trusts Elijah and his God and does as he asks without question. She trusts Elijah and his word from his God in the seemingly unending drought. Elijah's prophecy is that her containers of oil and flour will continue to flourish undiminished until the drought is broken, the drought that he prophesied and arguably brought to pass. As with the instigation of the drought and later its breaking in 1 Kings 18:41, Elijah's words are faithful and true. The oil and flour remain, and Starte's circumstances shift from poverty to abundance. Again, the miraculous reversal of her fortune are ripe for exploitation in prosperity gospel and related theological constructions. In the second episode of Umastarte's story with Elijah, she takes the initiative and speaks her mind, evoking the Syrophoenician woman who similarly gives Jesus a piece of her mind in Mark 7:28 and Matthew 15:27. There are likely enduring stereotypes about foreign women at play in all of these texts. Though these two stories about the widow of Zarephath are sequential, they are separated by the passage of an undisclosed amount of time. During that time, her child, whose age is indeterminate, becomes ill and stops breathing. The reader is left to infer that the child is dead, though the does not explicitly say so. Elijah was still at hand, residing with a small family, as Elisha would stay with the Shunammite woman and her husband in the spare room that she had built for him in 2 Kings 4. That story intentionally duplicates elements of this story to demonstrate that Elisha is indeed Elijah's successor. Umastarte blames Elijah and his powers for the presumptive death of her son. First, she accuses him of killing her son to hurt her, asking what he could possibly have against her, she who provided for him and at whose table he still eats and under whose roof he still resides. Speaking in a flurry, Umastarte moves on before Elijah can respond to the charge. She accuses him of another motive. He has taken her child as a punishment for an undisclosed sin. Her theology is achingly familiar. Someone must be responsible. He is. But why would he do such a thing without a reason? Maybe it is her fault, but it is not, though this is not an uncommon grief response. Surely, in the time that Elijah has spent with his family, affections have kindled. It is not hard to imagine a fatherless boy looking up to the mighty prophet who has so drastically changed the estate of his family, and it is not difficult to imagine Elijah developing his own affection for the widow and her child. I choose to read his response as a caring uncle in addition to as a pastoral one. Elijah carries Umastarte's son up to the room in which he's been living in their home, places him on his own bed, and then stretches out on him 3 times in a way that some understand to have caused sufficient chest compressions to revive the boy. It is at this point of the story that it is revealed that the boy is a child, a yeled, younger than a youth, a na'ar, and older than a toddler. So preteen, somewhere between kindergarten and preteen. When the revival, resuscitation, or resurrection, medical miracle, or the breath and hand of God, the child is restored to life and his mother as his breath was restored to him. And she affirms that Elijah is a man of God and that the word of the Holy One in his mouth is true. For the first and only time, she uses that holy name herself. And so it appears that Elijah has been conducting religious education courses. Now, in this second episode of the widow's story with Elijah, Umastarte, as a bereaved and desperate woman, is easily recognized by contemporary readers. Some will have their own stories of medical miracles and unexpected recoveries. Some will have stories of social and economic intervention and assistance from religious communities or medical services offered through religious missions. But some will read with an ache in the heart for the child that was not saved. Umastarte is more than a shadow of a character. She has voice and agency, but only in the second story. My womanist sensibilities require that she has her own encounter with the Israelite God. Otherwise, Elijah is just another colonizer using religious language to couch his demands and expecting native folk to hand over their resources without question. Using my sanctified nation, I invite the reader to overhear that first conversation between Umastarte and God. Umastarte was spending more and more time each day looking for wood that was getting harder and harder to find. Hers was not the only hungry mouth in her town. She was not the only one looking for scraps of firewood. One day she heard a voice as strong as thunder and as gentle as rain. Umastarte, daughter of Astarte. Umastarte. She unbent her aching back and looked around. She saw some children playing. She ran at them, clapping her hands and shouting, "Shoo, shoo, go home to your mothers." She bent back over the bramble she was breaking into manageable pieces, and she heard it again. Umastarte. Who speaks to me? She cried. The liquid thunder voice spoke again. I am God whose name is holy, the God of all creation. Are you Baal? Baal is a child playing at my feet. I am the God of gods. What do you want with me? I am sending you my prophet. Do as he asks. What will he ask? The food on your table and in your child's mouth. Why would I do that? Because I will feed you and your child. My word is faithful and true. Muttering to herself, Umastarte takes her handful of sticks and goes home. When the prophet arrived, she determined to do as he asked. Only that and nothing more. She would put this God of gods to the test. The second reading I would like to share with you is the widow of Shunem, Elisha's similar story. Not widow, woman. 2 Kings 4:8. And it happened that one day Elisha passed through Shunem, and there was a wealthy woman. She pressed him to have a meal. Thus it was that whenever he passed that way, he would stop there for a meal. And she said to her man, "Look, I know that this is a holy man of God who regularly passes our way. Let us make then a small open-air chamber on the roof and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, that whenever he comes to us, he can stay there." Elisha's encounter with the widow in 2 Kings 4 is immediately followed by an encounter with another woman. She is wealthy. Her wealth is articulated before acknowledging that she has a man in the next verse. He is not described as wealthy. His existence and their relationship are secondary to her wealth, which occupies the primary place in her introduction. She is active, he is inactive. She discerns that the traveling man is a man of God, the regional term for prophet. And it is she who calls for them to prepare and furnish a room for the prophet's use whenever he chooses. Her "let us make" is the same as God's in the creation epic. The details of her labor and expense are not articulated. One might imagine her designing the space and instructing her man to do the labor. The prophet is clear that she and she alone is his benefactor in verses 12 through 13. He engages her and her alone in conversation to determine how he can repay her. And yet, she does not have a name in the text. Gervera, great lady, comes to mean the queen mother much later. But previously, it was used to indicate a woman of wealth or stature. So I shall call her Giverat Shunem, the lady of Shunem, as she may have been addressed. She has asked for nothing from the prophet. She is content with who she is and what she has, and that includes, as shall subsequently be revealed, a child-free life. When asked if she desires or requires any intercession with the monarch or military commander, perhaps she was being overtaxed in some way, and who is not, she declined, saying, "In the midst of my people do I dwell." She has a community around her, and she is content. It is exceedingly rare to find a biblical woman who is not devastated at not having children and is content with her lot in life. Contentment to the point of turning down favors from on high is otherwise unheard. Not content with her own answer on behalf of herself, wanting to do something for her, but also not accepting her self-articulation, Elisha has a conversation with another man, more likely a boy, since the term Na'ar indicates youth, as we saw previously, a conversation about her, but not with her. Elisha and his servant boy Gehazi decide that what she needs is a child for which she has not asked, and though she was certainly capable of asking for one. While a child was certainly the most high value reward a woman could receive in the framework of the text and its underlying culture, it is striking that she expresses no such desire and is completely, therefore, puzzling to the men around her. It's also important to note the text does not say she is too old to conceive, even when it emphasizes her partner's great age. This is an almost emasculating portrayal of him. In verse 16, Elijah declares to the woman that she will have a child, a son, in the turn of the year. This annunciation language is similar to that spoken by the divine messenger to Samson's mother in Judges, a woman for whom there was no name, but whom the rabbis named Zilel Ponit. And the Annunciation language is similar to that in Judges 13 for Samson, you shall conceive and give birth to a son, and similar to that of Gabriel for the Virgin Mary in Luke 13. But only Givarat Shunem says, nope. Givarat Shunem's first response was, oh no, my lord, using the slave-holding title that is also serving as a form of polite address and as a signifier for God replacing the most holy name. And this is why I don't use Lord in the lectionary and ever, because it is a slave-holding title and therefore not sufficient for God in my theology. And you can read about that in the introduction to any volume of the lectionary, and 3 of the 4 are published. Rejecting the possibility, possibly thinking that he's making some sort of joke at her expense, she tells him not to deceive her. This provides the barest hint that perhaps she did long for a child, and the promise of one that would turn out to be a cruel joke would be more than she could bear. Throughout all of this, she speaks to him as his equal and not his supplicant, quite different from Hannah, who abases herself before Eli, referring to herself in the third person as his slave woman. Givarat Shunem conceives and gives birth to a son as Elisha prophesied. And then the narrative turns to her son and her spouse. An unknown but significant period of time has passed. By 2 Kings 4:18, the boy is old enough to walk independently to his father working the harvest. The text refers to him as a yeled, a child. He is ill and reports his symptoms to his father, which raises the question, where was her? What was their parenting like? Was she out conducting the business that was responsible for her great wealth? Was she home but working, weaving, throwing pottery, making objects to sell? Was she performing time-sensitive agricultural labor on a delicate and valuable crop? Or perhaps the nature of the illness or injury, menial or neurological, led to him going outside for help when there really was help in the house. At this point, the narrative introduces a new character, a servant, a boy, another indication of wealth. This boy is at least bigger than the failing child and carries him at his master's request to his mother and places him in her lap, describing a Pieta tableau with the mother holding the body of her son as he dies. She held him while he was dying for what seems to be a period of hours, until noon in 2 Kings 2:20. Imagine. This also raises the question as to why she did not seek help before her child died. Perhaps she was unwilling to abandon him in those final, most precious hours, particularly if it would all be for naught. The boy dies, and his mother carries him upstairs herself and places him on the bed she provided for Elisha. This suggests that the child is still a child, making it possible for his mother to carry the dead weight of his body up a flight of stairs. As she prepares to pursue the prophet, she holds responsible for her predicament. More details of wealth emerge. A number of boy servants and a number of donkeys. Using the imperative voice, command form, she tells her man to send her one of the boys and one of the donkeys so that she can go to the man of God. He questions, why should she go today? It's not a day of religious observance. She doesn't respond to his question with a direct answer. Instead, she simply tells him, all will be well, and she goes on about her business. She commands her servant boy to keep her donkey moving and not worry about trying to accommodate her with a ladylike pace. Now there's urgency to her actions. Though it has not been previously revealed, she knows where to find Elisha on Mount Carmel, the site of his legendary challenge to Baal and slaughter of his prophets while leaving Asherah and her prophets unchallenged and undisturbed, and that's a whole other story. On seeing her approach, Elisha sends his boy, the one who came up with the idea of getting her pregnant, to. It is a sign of respect for her status to have someone accompany her back to Elisha. She dismisses the boy's pleasantries with, all is well. Elisha finally dispenses with the middleman, acknowledging that he does not know what is wrong and that God has hidden it from him. And then she gives him what we call in my culture a piece of her sanctified mind. Did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not? Do not lead me to false hope. Her speech is direct. Elisha's urgency matches hers, sparing no time to respond to her in speech. He tells his servant boy to gird up his loins, which means to tie up all the dangly bits so that when you run, they won't swing around and hurt you. The young man is to retie the winding cloth in such a way as to restrain his male organs so that they will not swing about, inflicting pain on him when he runs. Elisha's language about the child changes in this scene. He asks if the child is all right and then tells his servant boy to lay his staff on the face of the boy. Now he's calling the child a youth. The narrating voice that had first used child also uses youth. This is illustrative of the great age range indicated. It does not appear, she does not appear to be impressed by Elijah dispatching his servant. She wants him. And she swears on God's life that she is not going back home without him. In other words, he has no choice but to come back with her. To swear on God's life is the highest oath in the scriptures. It is the oath that God swears by their own unending existence. Given that, there's no need to swear on the life of the prophet. I read this as a threat. Come with me or die. Only then does he rise and go with her, meeting Gehazi and receiving the report that the boy is still in the sleep of death. Entering the room alone, in verse 33, leaves us to question who supplied the details. But then Elisha performs a resuscitation or revivification, depending on the theology of the reader. And the mother is put outside with everyone else. Perhaps Jesus would learn from this as he brought the parents of the little girl he raised from the dead into the room with him when he shut everyone else out. It is a curiously intimate process, the weight of the grown man's body pressing upon the child and the mouth-to-mouth contact have led some to surmise it was a form of CPR. However, that pressure was insufficient to raise the child, but it did something. The cooling flesh of the boy began to warm. The prophet paces the room, clearly at a loss. This is unlike the other resurrection stories that happen instantly. A second application of bodily pressure, and the child opens his eyes and sneezes. I imagine the woman is pressed up against the door, praying and waiting for the prophet and why it took so long. But she would have heard those sneezes even if the door was closed, and she would have ripped that door off its hinges. In my womanist sanctified imagination, there's no need for him to tell her to take up the son from the bed. She had already flown in and lifted the child to her breast. Next, she bends down and reverences Elisha. Givarat Shunem was a confident, authoritative woman who suffered no fools and brooked no disagreement. She funded and ran her own household, including her husband. She enriched their religious life by inviting and to some degree engaging Elisha to be a prophet in residence, as contemporary congregations will often engage a scholar in residence. She has a religious life that is indicated by her ability to recognize Elisha as a prophet when her husband cannot. Her actions to keep this man of God in her life and that of her household, her belief that there's something he can do or something God can do after death to restore life. Her husband is not even an afterthought. He was abandoned in the text when he questioned why she would go to Elisha when there was no relief approaching. He does not mourn or even acknowledge the death of his son. It does not occur to him that there's any help, not even in God, for their loss. Like many biblical women, he and his son share the fate of namelessness as well. There's a second chapter of her story in 2 Kings 8. At some later date, Elisha returns home with a protective warning. There will be a 7-year famine. He tells her to pack up her household and go. Again, it is her household and her authority over it, her wealth, her agency. Her husband is neither addressed nor mentioned. His presence must be assumed or inferred. Elisha does not tell her where to go. He trusts that she's competent to choose wisely. She moves to Philistia, a wealthy coastal nation. Upon her return, she appeals successfully to the Israelite monarch for the return of her land. In that proceeding, she became a witness to Elisha's power to raise the dead. Women have been testifying to resurrection for a long time. An official is assigned to her case to make sure she gets back everything she left behind and everything she would have earned in interest if she had stayed. The final line of the final scriptural chapter of her life, 2 Kings 8:6, is a worthy epitaph. Return all that was hers and all the revenue of the fields from the day she left the land until now. Thank you. Thank you. While Canon Jennifer is coming, normally time for questions. I'll be around a little bit and I will sign books at this table over here if you have brought them.
Great. Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful high energy morning. And I took note of your comment about how some congregations have scholars in residence. So maybe we hold that in prayer for the Holy One. And thank you.
Yeah.
It has been a wonderful morning. We look forward to hearing you preach tomorrow and appreciate all of your time. So help me thank Dr. Gafney.